Hello. You may have watched my previous video where I summarised the 10 most common criticisms of the MBTI. Now this video repeats those criticisms but then fills in some of the reasoning behind why those criticisms are often simplistic and sometimes misinformed or wrong. I'm Dr. Roy Childs and my views are informed by many years as a trainer in a wide range of different instruments, and I'm also a test author and a British Psychological Society BPS verifier and a consultant editor for the BPS test review process. This means that I review a wide range of tests and questionnaires, and I have become increasingly critical of the direction that psychometrics is taking, and I've become more aware of how uninformed people are about the fundamental issues, even well-respected academics. The vitriol against the MBTI by respectable academics can be partisan and uninformed and wrong, but their supposed expertise makes their comments far more impactful than they deserve to be. So let me elaborate. But I suspect that everyone is aware of the increasing polarisation in our public debate, the Brexit Leave Remain, or pro-life pro-choice, or Biden-Trump issues. And this polarisation can be seen in the type versus the trait approaches to personality. For simplicity, I will place a type, Jung and MBTI on one side and the trait, Big Five and psychometric model on the other. So let me begin. If the Good Friday Agreement enabled Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness to overcome their bitter rivalry, they became known as the Chuckle Brothers, then I'm sure we can do something similar. We need to listen and then learn to disagree well. Here are the 10 most common criticisms of the MBTI, used as evidence that the results are meaningless. So just check whether you've heard them and which you agree or disagree with. And you may want to pause the video to read these. Sometimes the criticisms go behind the MBTI to attack Jung's underlying theory. And as I go through each criticism, bear in mind that behind the critic's argument there is usually an implicit or explicit belief that trait represents better science than type approaches. The first criticism is about the background of the developers, and Isabel Briggs Myers and her mum were just untrained housewives. Carl Jung, their inspiration, was a wacky psychologist disregarded by the mainstream. And if that seems persuasive, we would also discount electromagnetism. Faraday was just a self-taught scientist. Genetics, Mendel was just a humble monk. Continental drift, Wegener was not a geologist. Relativity, Einstein dreamt up E equals mc squared on the bus to the patents office. And Leonardo da Vinci, well, he was just a jack of all trades and a master of none. Science often progresses from the left field ideas, so attacking the background does not make any of these ideas or the MBTI unscientific. The second criticism is that type is not comprehensive, but who says it should be? Only those who are seeking a comprehensive map, and that was not what Jung's type theory was trying to do. So criticism 2 is like criticising a pig for not flying. It was never meant to. So again, this is a very weak argument. The claim that MBTI theory is unscientific can be approached from several angles, and criticism 3 focuses on the emergence of type theory, which clearly comes from Jung's insights based on a limited number of clinical cases, plus many years observing people. But science often does progress from limited observations, plus great intuition, which can become a theory with testable hypotheses. But unlike the Big Five, type theory goes beyond describing personality differences and proposes how the elements interact in a dynamic way. Now, science wants supporting evidence, but simply criticising type theory for how it emerged is another weak argument used to condemn the MBTI as unscientific. The claim that MBTI theory is unscientific can be approached from several angles. Criticism 3 focuses on how type theory emerged, which clearly came from Jung's insights based on a limited number of clinical cases. But let's not forget many years observing people as well. And Jung's theory is more than a description of personality. It proposes how personality elements interact in a dynamic way. This is the basis of good science, a theory that generates hypotheses that can be tested. Hence, how the theory emerged is another weak argument used to condemn the MBTI as unscientific. The implication is that the trait approach is more scientific, and I can agree that its beginnings back to Cattell did have a more objective starting position. He wanted to know what to describe and how many factors were required to develop a comprehensive map or taxonomy. And he started by taking all the personality-related words in the dictionary. Combined with factor analysis, this convinces many people that it is scientific. But is this sufficient? Cattell was well aware of the pitfalls of statistical manipulation, such as avoiding author bias, where an author can unwittingly oversample an area, let's say anxiety, and hey presto, a major anxiety factor will emerge. So whilst this approach represents a good start, it is insufficient. Good science needs more than rigorous methodology and sophisticated stats. It needs a depth of psychological theorizing and good measurement and good quality evidence. Cattell's bigger vision was to emulate chemistry, his initial area of study. He admired the beauty of how thousands of compounds were reduced to a handful of elements, and he wanted to reveal the equivalent periodic table of personality. Does today's Big Five reveal this periodic table? I suggest that is unlikely, and let me tell you why. Most Big Five and trait theories converge on a definition of personality summarized here. It refers to unique patterns of thoughts, feelings and behaviors, to relative stability, and to the way it is supposed to influence behavior or performance. And this definition is reflected in most Big Five questionnaires. For example, the NEO, supposedly the best marker for the Big Five, uses items that assess preferences. Item 2 is reported behavior. 3 is more about attitude. 4 may be something to do with motivation or preference. And 5 is about emotion. Likewise with Hogan's HPI and most other mainstream questionnaires. However, the rationale for such a range of items is never made explicit, and neither do they explain how such items should be sampled. They simply produce good psychometric properties. But the psychometric model was developed to measure intelligence, and if, like me, you believe that this is an inappropriate model for the more dynamic concept of personality, then this lack of alternative rationale is a theoretical weakness, which detracts from the Big Five's claim of being scientific. Furthermore, Cattell argued that the Big Five were simply the 5 factors that survived clumsy factor analysis. Take any broad range of items and they can usually be put through the factor analytic funnel to produce 5 factors. And Cattell argued that they were not always the same Big Five. We can investigate potential divergences by examining what is under the bonnet. These are NEO's underlying facets for extroversion, and these are 16 PFs. The facets are different. Should assertiveness be part of extroversion? Yes, says NEO. No, says 16 PF. And why do all NEO's 5 factors have exactly 6 facets? Is this empirical? Or is it a Costa and McRae need for symmetry? I've also looked at MBTI Step 2. Again, there are superficial similarities, but also clear differences. I suggest this is due to the lack of theoretical rigour. This lack of rigour has had unfortunate knock-on effects. Today's popular commercially successful questionnaires, such as the OPQ, do claim to be underpinned by the Big Five. But OPQ's underlying facets are again different, and its development bypassed Cattell's mapping of the domain and the aim to get at the periodic table. Instead, they asked managers, what do you think is important at work? Now, ask people what they see in the physical world. They see compounds, such as rocks, water, baking powder, not H2O or sodium bicarbonate or the basic elements. And this same approach to developing profiles will identify things that we recognise or want, like this. Surely service orientation is a complex, multifactorial, and is different in different contexts. Many profiles are now shopping lists of attractive labels: persuasiveness, controlling, decisiveness, service orientation, and the lists get ever longer. Scientific beginnings do not guarantee scientific outcomes. Another knock-on effect is the impact on the nature of the items. See how the OPQ scale for decisiveness is measured. These items are clearly not designed to probe the fundamentals of personality. They're more like a competency survey, letting a person say what they believe or wish to project about themselves. And then factor analysis can be used to group such results into 5 blocks that overlap with the Big Five, leading to claims of rigour and scientific credibility. Perhaps we need to question the rigour of the Big Five. Since increasingly diverse range of items all get summarised as a Big Five using factor analysis, does this provide evidence that the Big Five is fundamental, or that it is too broad and loose to be called a scientific theory? Perhaps the 5 broad factors are just a convenient way to categorise, like the Big Three taxonomy: animal, vegetable or mineral. If you're interested, I gave a talk entitled From Shakespeare to Gogglebox, in which I challenged the claim that advances in personality measurement are technical rather than psychological. So let me draw together arguments against criticism 3. I hope we can agree that a good scientific theory stimulates ideas and debate. Since the dominance of the Big Five, debates such as what factors, how many factors would make a good periodic table have faded. Is the answer 5? Or could it be 16, 30 or 100? And is discussion about the Big Two or the Big One a logical way to go with factor analysis, as some suggest? Or are we simply paralleling the oversimplification of cognitive ability as another big one, IQ? Could the Big Five be like a blanket, curtailing curiosity, at least within psychometrics, and the search for deeper, more complex, more dynamic models, or for more elementary classifications? The initial aim was to find the elementary ingredients of personality. Has this been abandoned for shopping lists of attractive finished products, the ready meal option? Are we satisfied with a 5-page catalogue for classifying the complexities of personality? So criticism 3, based on the better scientific credentials of trait theory, can be challenged. Whilst it does tick some of the science boxes, there are many unresolved questions. Trait theory majors on method, which has provided a high-level map, but it leaves significant questions such as the underlying detail and the rationale for using eclectic items. And there are also questions about the quality of supporting evidence to be discussed later. Type theory, on the other hand, has less objective beginnings, but it does more than just description. It generates hypotheses, for example, about how fundamental underlying cognitive functions interact and influence personality, which needs to be tested. We should acknowledge that type and trait have different beginnings and different scientific strengths. So saying that type theory is less scientific is too simplistic, and possibly the opposite is true, which I will illustrate with criticism 4. Criticism 4 is about how people answer the questionnaires. What do you do may seem more rigorous than what do you prefer, and the eclectic range of items always includes items about what do you do, such as this one. This is not surprising given psychology's desire to be recognised as a science, plus its legacy behaviourism, and we may all agree that what you say is not as important as what you do. But Milgram's infamous experiments reminded us that what people do does depend on context. Here, it was people with white coats persuading subjects to administer what they thought was lethal electric shocks. Behaviour introduces contextual noise, and some questionnaires reduce this by asking typically or on average. But average hides so much. Should we ignore context? We should consider the context dilemma. Walter Mischel famously makes the point in this book, arguing that context has more influence on behaviour than personality. And more recently, Professor Jerome Kagan in this book calls his first chapter Missing Context. Let me illustrate by asking you to think of life as a tug of war, with this end representing the inside, including personality, and this end representing the outside or context. The inside is what brings consistency or continuity as we traverse life. But what is the red ribbon? It represents behaviour, and sometimes context dominates what we do, sometimes who I am takes over. To get a clearer picture of personality requires the decoupling of behaviour from the inner me. What I do is not necessarily who I am. We need to separate being from doing, reducing behavioural noise. Unfortunately, this behavioural noise is being amplified. The OPQ says it measures a work personality, i.e. by thinking of yourself at work. But that is behaviour in context. Is that personality or is it a role? Concepts that overlap, but they are not the same thing. Similarly, the best known role questionnaire, Belbin, does not ask about behaviour in a specific team, but in some generalised concept of what you take across different teams. But behaviour in a leadership team can be quite different from a sports club or a voluntary group that you work in. It is not really a role questionnaire. Generalised behaviour across groups may better be defined as a team personality. This demonstrates a lack of theoretical rigour concerning behavioural noise, and certainly it applies to many mainstream personality questionnaires. I wonder, has the MBTI done any better? Examining MBTI items shows a similar eclectic range of items as the mainstream. And this first item, I'm usually a good mixer, not only asks about behaviour, but also introduces the concept of good. And yet all personality questionnaires say there's no right or wrong, there's no good or bad. But where MBTI does score in reducing behavioural noise is with the overarching mindset of preference. Now clearly item 1 shows how Isabel did not write all her items with a clear focus on preference, but she did introduce the word pairs, which makes indicating preference easier. And this was a bold decision for this untrained housewife, challenging psychological orthodoxy, and I suggest this is one of MBTI's strengths. But the MBTI does not go far enough. Consider the preference challenge. Would you rather have a week of love or excitement, have diarrhea or constipation, be stuck in a lift with an ISTJ or an ENFP? They are not always easy choices. Everyone says it depends because they recognise the role of context. And why is think of yourself at home with the slippers on a solution? Is that the real you? Some people are more engaged, more alive, more themselves up on the moors, in the woods, at sea, or at the football club. MBTI makes the same mistake as OPQ. It suggests a context, and the issues of preference continue. because preference can be influenced by your current role. People often confuse or merge role with personality, or it could be your comfort zone, which may be a natural place, or it may be an avoidance of something more challenging. And it could be an outdated stereotype, what you've always said. People often fail to update their sense of who they have become. And sometimes preference is an imaginary you, the person you'd like to be or could be. And sometimes your preference is not really your preference. It may be other people, such as your parents or an idol. And sometimes it is part of yourself that has been neglected for too long. So in the quest for simplicity, has preference been trivialized? Because of course it does depend. We need to think more about the mindset when completing a questionnaire. This image symbolizes our visible exterior and the more private inside. And then consider meeting this man, or this man, or this little girl. You would react and behave differently. And we need to help people to recognize what I call the contextual self, which contaminates personality results. We're inviting people to express who they think they are behind the roles they play, and I call this the identity self. Preference is a useful mindset for that, but given the many interpretations of preference, I suggest a manageable solution, recognizing that we all have an ideal self, the person I or my parents want me to be. How can those who want to understand the human condition neglect the ideal self? We introduced it with the TDI, part of the type mapping system, by the simple addition of the preference question, which is, describe it the way it is and then the way you want. Yes, this was stolen from Will Schutz and the FIRO, but the evidence is that 72% of people then report two different types. There is their is preference and their want preference. I suggest that everyone lives with a difference between their sense of who they are and who they would like to be, unless they are a fully paid up narcissist. The is-want question reveals this, and to me this is a much richer exploration of personality than getting to best fit type. But first, let me complete number 4 of the 4 selves. This is because the road to self-awareness is never complete, and most people claim to be above average in self-awareness because they're not aware of what they're not aware of. So I remind people that there is also an undiscovered self, and to consider what they might learn if they were, say, in an earthquake or suddenly a refugee. We only know ourselves within the limits of our experience, so flagging the undiscovered self keeps the door open to further exploration. In summary, both type and trait questionnaires have weaknesses in how they ask the questions. I call this the mindset issue. MBTI is criticised for introducing a woolly concept, preference. The trait approach is criticised for introducing typical or average. How would this person respond? And by implication all of us, since we all have two sides, hopefully not as dramatically as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And then both approaches instruct people not to ponder too long. Why? If we are using type for self-exploration, for personal development, does that need to be hurried? Don't we want people to reflect, to update their thinking about themselves? To me, don't ponder too long is a ludicrous instruction which comes from a selection mentality. Why MBTI fell into that mindset beats me. But I challenge the criticism that preference is a weak indicator of personality. I would suggest the opposite. It is a strength since it begins to reduce behavioural noise, but unfortunately MBTI does not take that far enough. I suggest that both camps would benefit from decoupling personality from behaviour. Now let's look at criticism 4, which begins looking at the psychometric evidence used to berate type. And to illustrate, please complete the preference test. Make sure you have a piece of paper to record your answers, and if you need to, you can pause the video. But look at this first item. It asks you to look around, wherever you are at this point in time, and to point at something interesting. And now record which hand you pointed with by marking L, R or N, short for left, right or neither, stroke both. And do the same for the next 11 items. And now calculate your total score by allocating 1 point for every L, 2 points for every N and 3 points for every R. Add them up and that will give you your total score. You will have a score between 12 and 36, and I've run this test multiple times. When I gather people's scores together, I always get a distribution that looks like this. And even very well qualified academics use this as evidence that personality characteristics differ by degree and that the type theory of opposites is wrong. They claim that the theory of opposites predicts a bimodal distribution. But you do have two distinct entities. You do have a left and a right hand. And a person who scores 28 does not change gear with their right shoulder. In the same way, if extroversion and introversion are opposites, they can also be expressed at different times to fit different contexts and in different proportions. Hence, continuous scores is predicted by the theory of opposites in the same way as has just been demonstrated here with your left and right hands. Hence, if you hear the criticism that lack of bimodality invalidates type theory, you can be sure that the person has not understood type theory. And of course we all make mistakes, but if they claim to have expertise, then they are either being lazy or negligent. Professor Joel Mitchell provides a devastating critique of the inappropriate use of numbers in psychometrics, and way before him both Thorndike and James Cattell are quoted as saying, unluckily, our professors of psychology in general are not up to quantitative logic. Perhaps we should be more sceptical of the academics who fall back on simple, orthodox psychometrics for answering complex questions about the nature of personality. And criticism 6 is related, that type takes a more static model of personality. Does it? Take this person's score, 7, on extroversion. Does it mean less time extroverting than a 10? Does it mean extroverting with less intensity than a 10? The 7 is an ambiguous average, even if it is measured to 2 decimal places. How many people say things like, I'm pretty sociable, but I appreciate spending time on my own? They recognise both ends of the scale. Perhaps a good questionnaire helps them to identify how they balance each end. I suggest that a person's experience of themselves is less as a 7 and more as some of this and a bit more of that. This gets to the heart of the type concept of personality. Perhaps the trait model has adopted the concept of continuity too uncritically. Why should psychological characteristics conform to the bell curve like height and weight? The accusation that type takes a more static view of personality is not necessarily justified. In fact, when properly understood, the opposite is true. It views personality as more dynamic. The 7th criticism is another angle on whether type presents a static versus a dynamic model of personality. MBTI has contributed to the impression of being a static model, firstly by presenting type as 16 boxes. Without explanation, this sometimes causes this reaction. And MBTI has also traditionally presented scores one-sidedly, which adds to the misinterpretation of being in a box. A more accurate way to present the scores would be like this, which reminds people of both preferences. It also indicates the degree of balance or imbalance. And secondly, the MBTI community uses language saying, I am a WXYZ type. Now this suggests landing on a correct or fixed type. And we know that questionnaires can be inaccurate, so a good facilitator is encouraged to help people to find their best fit type. But again, this suggests a final destination, whereas Jung certainly saw type as a station on a longer journey. So perhaps the MBTI community is stuck thinking of type as innate. Now I don't want to address that thorny topic here, but suffice to say that the MBTI identifies type using self-report, i.e. what people say or believe or want to project about themselves. Regardless of whether type is innate or not, self-reported type is about people's narrative, and those with a personal development focus are in the business of helping people to evolve their narrative. So people's autobiographical narrative is expected to change. Hence I prefer to be more accurate by saying I currently report as a WXYZ type. At least this signals the possibility of change. And if you use the TDI is want version I mentioned earlier, this then automatically opens the door. It reveals a person's uncertainty, their internal dialogue, potential questions about who they are and who they are becoming. So saying I am a WXYZ type contributes to the inaccurate accusation that type labels put you in a box, suggesting rigidity. Criticism 8 focuses on one of the clarion calls of psychometrics, reliability. But what does it mean? Reliability implies accuracy. What is the evidence condemning MBTI? That more than 50% of people report a different type after just a few weeks. But accuracy of abstract concepts is tricky. Early psychometrics landed on a solution for intelligence by making the assumption that intelligence doesn't change. Hence we can use a proxy for accuracy, which works in the physical world, consistency. We can be confident that height hasn't changed, or at least within a few weeks, and so consistency may be correlated with accuracy. But look at this target. You can be consistently wrong. The no change assumption has been controversial when applied to intelligence, but I suggest it's even more debatable when applied to personality. It views personality through a static lens. This becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy by influencing how we measure it. And in the don't ponder too long instruction, what people do is answer what they've always said. And so the psychometric model bakes in no change. Type, on the other hand, has a more dynamic view of personality. Hence, the traditional psychometric reliability indices are interesting but less appropriate. And compounding this dilemma is that traditional indices are based on hard numbers, by which I mean that we can be confident that a 5 is more than a 4. But self-report questionnaires are soft numbers. When I rate myself on 4 as sociable, am I really less sociable than when you rate yourself a 5? We use these scales differently, and we apply different definitions and benchmarks. So can such numbers be used to infer things like personality does not change, or even that personality is genetic? I challenge the belief that self-report measures personality. It doesn't. It measures a correlate by extracting a person's latest autobiographical narrative. And we do not need to debate whether personality is fixed. The question is, how does a person's narrative about themselves change? And if 50% of people change type within a few weeks, it could be seen as achieving its goal of stimulating greater self-awareness by helping people to reflect on their narrative, to consider its accuracy, to help them to develop their narrative, and hence saying that MBTI is unreliable is based on multiple misunderstandings. It does not factor in the nature of self-report or the nature of soft numbers or the dynamic nature of personality. Jung observed that people get stuck and fail to develop. The purpose of psychological type was as a compass for navigating the next stage of life, something that psychometric reliability does not begin to cover. And now the clincher, criticism 9, that MBTI results are meaningless because the results have no validity. The expectation is that it should predict behaviour. Now, I've talked a fair bit about behaviour, and I do note that trait questionnaires offer predictive validities, correlations with some kind of behavioural outcomes that hover between 0.2 and 0.4. That is interesting at a general level. Basically, it's looking at large groups, but it's not so useful at the individual level. A parallel is Boyle's law, which predicts how large numbers of gas molecules behave, but does not help predict the behaviour of individual molecules. And also, how impressive are correlations of 0.2 to 0.4? There is evidence that asking a simple question like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how persuasive are you? It produces similar levels of prediction. Why? Well, what people say about themselves does have some relation to reality for most people. This questions the value of using 200-item questionnaires for that level of prediction. And what they predict is often imprecise. Ratings of varied or generalized measures of behavior or performance. Now, while such results can be interesting, they are limited. And if you want to explore the significant issues with such generalized averages, you could start by reading this book by Todd Rose. So criticism 9, that MBTI has no validity, is applying a model of validity that has significant weaknesses, and it is based on a static, consistent, reliable predictor score being aimed at a well-defined and unchanging target. That is not the world we live in. And applying it to type, it does not factor in context and the difference between behaviour and personality. It assumes that personality and the world we live in are relatively static, and it does not address the issue of self-report and soft numbers. And it proceeds to use stats that may reveal interesting trends, but based on generalised averages that are not suitable for understanding individuals. I suggest that we need different ways of validating, ways that apply to a more dynamic approach to personality, that incorporate change and development, and we need to understand that the MBTI only partially operationalizes the type theory. So we need better measures of type, which allows us to validate how increasing self-awareness and decoupling role from personality can increase behavioural flexibility. Jung saw type as a vehicle for better adaptation to both a person's environment and to their internal disposition. Now, this is a big challenge, which may explain why it has not made it onto the psychometric or even the MBTI research agenda yet. But the accusation that MBTI results have no validity is equivalent to the pigs don't fly accusation. The wrong method is being used. And finally, with criticism 10, that the reports are like horoscopes, is back to misunderstandings. Their positivity is often cited. They're too nice. First of all, the best reports are not full of Barnum statements, something that trait questionnaires can also be accused of. And type reports are not supposed to describe the person. They describe what those preferences look like when a person whose psyche is in harmony, a well-developed example of the type, and the downside of it can be explored by examining their opposite type, which provides a mirror to those blemishes that the person may find more difficult or irritating. So once again, The accusation that MBTI reports are like horoscopes is based on a misunderstanding. So those are 10 of the most common accusations, and I would like to conclude by suggesting that we reframe what personality is and what questionnaires provide. I prefer to think of personality as like an MRI scan. Different parts of us get activated by different contexts or stimuli, and how they interact, interconnect, switch on and off is dynamic. Personality is less a profile but a mosaic of characteristics, and it is in constant evolution, perhaps like an unfinished painting. The form may be there, but it is never fully coloured in. Traditionally, personality looks backwards. That's how I became the person I am today. But type is a model for looking forward to what I am becoming. And in that process, I would like more recognition of how experience shapes us. Life chips away, and whatever material we were born with, that chipping slowly reveals who we really are becoming. So to conclude, I didn't want this to fuel a tennis match between right and wrong. I have pushed back on what I consider to be unfair or uninformed criticisms of type, mostly directed at the MBTI, and this is to redress the balance. The criticisms from academia have been rather one-sided. A better understanding of type theory may help us achieve what has been achieved in physics. Two very different theories, wave theory and quantum theory, coexist. Both bring something valuable, and there is value in both type and trait. Take away the vitriol, recognize neither is right or wrong, and we can benefit from exploring the insights that each one brings. I like the metaphor that personality models are like still pictures. Behind every profile there is a person who lives, breathes and moves, and our job is to make those snapshots come to life. So I hope this video has stimulated ideas about personality, and that in our quest for understanding the human condition, we should all expand our thinking about what we mean by personality. The current approach by mainstream psychometrics may have given us a useful map, but it is constrained by the psychometric model that takes a rather narrow and rigid view of this complex concept. So no matter how you view personality, perhaps Jung's quote should be borne in mind. He said, "Learn your theories and your models well, but put them aside when you meet the miracle of the human soul." Thank you for listening.